The other thing that I'm curious about as it relates to dopamine is pornography. I think pornography has become more readily available now than ever before.
Certainly.
I can go on any social media platform, especially X, and I scroll down for long enough, I will be exposed to pornography, whether I chose to go and seek it out or not.
Yeah, it'll find you.
It'll find you on pretty much every application. So it's especially concerning for young people who are in those formative years. But what is your view on pornography, dopamine, and the overall social harm of pornography?
Yeah, so this is a controversial topic because obviously people have different opinions on limiting personal freedom, right? Both expression and consumption of pornography, right? But moving that aside and just focusing on things through the lens of biology and the dopamine system, we know that the more stimulating, the more intense an experience, the greater the increase in dopamine. I mean, it's very clear based on neuroimaging studies that, more amphetamine causes bigger increases in dopamine than less amphetamine. More cocaine causes bigger increases in dopamine than less cocaine. Caffeine can cause an increase in dopamine, but it's not nearly the kind of increase, the peak that is, that you observe with amphetamine or cocaine, all right? So we can't just say stimulants, and we can't just say sex. We can't just say pornography. We have to ask within the domain of pornography, because we know that sexual activity, and in particular anticipation of sexual activity, okay, this is important. Anticipation of sexual activity raises dopamine levels. Then the question is, what is the range of things and the range of dopamine increase? Now, while there hasn't been a very systematic exploration of this, we know that, a lot of pornography is extreme, right? It involves more than two people. It can involve all sorts of dynamics that for some people are going to be hyperstimulatory, okay? So this is very different than, I guess, what people would call soft pornography, quote unquote, right? And here, these are subjective labels. Mm-hmm. So let's just pick a hypothetical scenario. A person is viewing a lot of, let's say, high intensity, high dopamine for them, releasing pornography. Okay, for some people that might be pornography of genre A. For other people, it might be pornography of genre B. For somebody who never looks at pornography, maybe it's quite mild, but for them, it's actually quite intense in terms of the amount of dopamine it releases. Now, what do we know based on dopamine dynamics? Remember, dopamine is the universal currency of motivation, seeking, and reward. It's not like there's dopamine unique to pornography versus dopamine unique to food. It's just a matter of levels and duration. If somebody is consuming, let's call it very intense, AKA high dopamine releasing pornography on a regular basis, what do we know? That peak in dopamine will start to lessen. It'll be lower and lower, and the trough in dopamine after they view that pornography will be deeper trough and longer trough, meaning they are very likely, we don't know for sure, but very likely to seek out more and more intense experiences to try and just get them back to baseline. Pretty soon, the pornography that at one time was very stimulating for them is no longer stimulating. Now, the concern here is that, and let's just be frank, we're not just talking about viewing pornography. We also have to ask ourselves, what are people doing as they view this pornography? This is a conversation that should be had, but I have to do it in a way where I'm not imparting moral judgment on any of it. I'm not saying people should masturbate or not masturbate. That's none of my business, frankly. This is highly individual. It relates to all sorts of things in terms of values, et cetera. The point is, however, that we know that orgasm is a dopamine-related event, and post-orgasm, there's an increase in a molecule called prolactin in the brain. Prolactin actually, in part, sets the refractory period in which there can't be further erection in males and orgasm in males, okay? And in females, it really depends. I mean, there's this whole world. I mean, Dr. Rina Malik is far more skilled to discuss this than I am about, different types of orgasms in women, et cetera, the extent to which multiple orgasms can occur in some individuals, not others. I think the general belief is that it's possible in most anybody, including males and females, right? But that it's more typical in females than in males, this sort of thing. Here's the point. Dopamine and prolactin generally are in a kind of a push-pull or seesaw relationship, whereby very stimulatory, high dopamine releasing activities and pornography and things like that increase dopamine, but repeated exposure to that, regardless of the activities occurring during that time, lead to big, long troughs in dopamine, such that more stimulation is required just to get any sense of arousal. We also know that prolactin, when that is increased, tends to create a kind of subdued lack of dopamine. I'm using these terms broadly, kind of amotivated, non-motivated state. There are reasons for this biologically, right? After ejaculation, the idea is that animals won't then, or humans won't then copulate again and again and again, at least not for some period of time. The duration of the refractory period is highly individual. It's determined by age, by species. There's the so-called Coolidge effect. Are you familiar with the Coolidge effect?
I'm familiar with post-nut clarity.
Okay, slightly different. There's an anecdote that, at least to my understanding, is true. At least the Coolidge effect is a known thing in neuroendocrinology, whereby President Calvin Coolidge, reportedly, was visiting a chicken farm with his wife. They were touring the farm, and there were a lot of hens and a lot of chickens generally. And the docent who was showing them around said, you know, this rooster here, pointed to a rooster, copulates more than 300 times per day. It's remarkable. And Mrs. Coolidge turns to President Coolidge and says, you hear that? 300 times per day. She's obviously quite impressed and letting him know that. And Coolidge, that is President Coolidge, says, but let me ask you a question. Same hen or different hens? And the docent says, different hens. Now, here's the phenomenon, the Coolidge effect. It exists in rodents. It exists in chickens. It exists in dogs. People can speculate whether or not it exists in humans, whereby if an animal copulates, then the male is in a refractory period lasting anywhere from minutes to hours to days, depending on age, species, et cetera. During that refractory period, they can't achieve erection and or ejaculate again. But if you replace the mate with a novel mate, the refractory period is shortened substantially. Why? The answer is very clear based on actual measurements of brain dopamine. Why? Because dopamine is also associated with novelty. Now, the refractory period probably serves an important evolutionary role whereby it improves pair bonding so that post-ejaculation, post-orgasm, okay, here I'm interchangeably talking about these for males and females. You know, anytime you hear ejaculation, then people think males, etc. Post-orgasm, post-coital bliss, pair bonding, the sharing of pheromones, the sharing of stories, you know, the sharing of affection, right? The sharing of a bed to sleep in. These things are intimately involved in pair bonding. So I'm not saying that the refractory period is a bad thing. What I'm saying is that dopamine can overcome the refractory period, but the refractory period itself is largely due to an increase in prolactin that suppresses dopamine. So let's go back all the way to this question about pornography. What's the typical scenario? Well, this is not something I choose to think about a lot. You're talking about some individual in their apartment or home watching intense dopamine-stimulating pornography in which they presumably are aroused or not aroused. They do or don't do whatever they choose to do, but that over time has less and less of an effect in getting them aroused. And keep in mind that none of this necessarily translates to real-world human safe interactions between individuals, right? Pornography is very, very different than real-world sexual interactions. So there is a phenomenon that is starting to surface on the internet. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are a lot of questions posed in podcast forums, meaning in the comment section on YouTube, about is pornography dangerous? Is it bad, et cetera? I think the thing that we can say for sure is that any behavior, any substance that stimulates a lot of dopamine and that is easily accessed without effort is potentially problematic. Again, big increases in dopamine that are not preceded by effort are potentially problematic. Let's think about methamphetamine. Huge increase in dopamine. Was the brain designed to release dopamine in response to amphetamine? No, the brain was designed to dole out dopamine, give out dopamine at a level and duration that is commensurate with the pursuit of some evolutionarily adaptive goal. Methamphetamine bypasses that, gives you a huge surge in dopamine, which is why people feel miserable afterwards. They crave more just to get back to a lower level of dopamine. Same can be said of gambling, in particular in people that are very prone to gambling addiction. Certainly can be said for food, for certain people that are very prone to food addiction. Certainly can be true for anything. But when it comes to pornography, because of the, as you pointed out, the ready availability of pornography, in particular, let's just call it intense pornography, or that includes a lot of different other stimulatory elements, multiple people, a lot of scenarios that can be accessed on the internet, right? Certainly not things I'm suggesting people go look at, but that is potentially problematic because it raises the threshold of the person that's viewing this as what is arousing, to the point where pretty soon they need those hyperstimulatory environments or stimuli in the form of pornography in order to get aroused. And again, none of that translates into the ability to have conversation with partners or the ability to, have discussion in real world circumstances. And of course, everything we're talking about could also be translated to real world circumstances, but the data really point to the fact that younger people in particular are consuming more pornography. So we're talking about bigger dopamine increases with less, when I say effort, what I mean is kind of the more traditional thing was, at least when I was growing up, is you'd go out on a date or you'd meet somebody and there's a series of events that would happen prior to physical interactions, right? So this is potentially serious and problematic. There's a lot of judgment, and understandably so, because people arrive to this sort of discussion with a lot of different backgrounds in terms of religious backgrounds and what they think is okay or not okay. What I can tell you for sure is that I hear from a lot of young males about their challenges with porn addiction, and they want to know how to get over porn addiction. And the answer there is difficult, but very simple, which is abstinence. It's abstinence. It's taking a period of abstinence from pornography, maybe forever, maybe reducing the amount. This is where it gets very tricky, very subjective, and it's almost impossible to kind of have the discussion without getting into some murky territory.
Yeah.
But it's a real issue. And I know it's a real issue because I hear from thousands over the last few years of the podcast. I've heard from thousands of males that are like, they were addicted to porn.
How do they feel?
It sounds to me as if they feel very dejected. And some of them actually have said they felt very kind of misled, like almost like this natural stimulus for them was dangled in front of them and they just gravitated towards it the same way that any biological organism would gravitate towards something that was triggering its dopamine system. And now they feel depleted and kind of stuck, and they don't know what to do. And I don't necessarily think I'm the person to remedy all of this. I certainly am not, but I think there needs to be a conversation, much in the same way that Jonathan Haidt has done an amazing job with Anxious Generation of talking about some of the severe detriments to overuse of social media and social dynamics on social media, in particular in young girls, and how we're now finally realizing that we're in a mental health crisis, at least in part because of some of that, and we need to pay attention to it. I think there needs to be a discussion around pornography and some of the challenges it can potentially present, in particular for young males, which is not to say that girls and women aren't also looking at pornography, because we know they are. The data tell us that. But it does seem to be more of a problem that's being vocalized by young males. And this, of course, dovetails with the whole discussion about dating behavior and how that's changed in dating apps, and how the ready availability of kind of the possibility or anticipation of a partner is there, but actual dating behavior and real world sexual behavior is reduced. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be discussed. And, ideally we would have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a kind of panel of experts to talk about this. And maybe we do this together, as a service to the world, because I hear about this a lot. For instance, just by way of contrast, I'm not getting a ton of YouTube comments and emails from people saying, hey, I really struggle with, with ribeye steak addiction or with coffee addiction or energy drink addiction, maybe a little bit with energy drinks, but it's not crashing lives. It's not causing people to feel depressed, miserable about themselves. It's not causing people to have sexual dysfunction issues in real world interactions. I mean, this is also the concern, right? That young people are getting so attuned to certain dopamine dynamics related to pornography that they don't either get aroused or know how to handle real world intimate interactions.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.